You are listening to E-Radio Show by Missed Apex. We are electric. Hello everyone and welcome to the E-Radio Show. I'm Matt Trumpets and today's episode is called Nissan in Action. And joining us today is ace journalist, none other than Chris No More _ on Motorsports Stevens. How are we doing today, Chris?
Yeah, we're doing great, Matt. I mean, we certainly have quite a lot to talk about from what was certainly quite a chaotic race. Whether it was good or not is probably something we'll get to later, but we're not alone this week, Matt. We've brought a friend along.
No, terrifyingly enough, I have a whole nother person to deal with, and that would be none other than our favorite longtime guest and Formula E commentator par excellence, Anil Parmar. How are we doing today, Anil? It is so good to see you.
I know, it's been far too long, but you know what, Matt? I'm a simple guy. When I found out it had been 3 years since the first Paris E-Prix, which I think is when me and Chris first worked alongside each other a little bit, I figured I've got to be back on the show.
It was kind of the rekindling because we, after preseason testing, shared a bus to Beeston together, and who would have thought that such a beautiful friendship would blossom out of that 45-minute journey?
Yeah, I mean, I then got a job at Formula E, turned up in Paris, and young Chris is like tapping me on the shoulder, saying like, "Hi, Anil, let's be friends." And I mean, since then we've been besties.
The crazy thing, before that, you worked for Formula E Diary, which was the origins of this very podcast.
Absolutely. So if anything, we've brought Matt into the process. It's always been me and you.
Yeah,
and
man.
we've looped Matt in.
Well, I tell you what, before you two decide to get married, how about I tell the listeners at home, we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind permission of our better halves, bringing you race reviews, news from the paddock, and tech analysis. We live stream our race reviews, so be sure to subscribe to E-Radio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our chat room as well. Oopsies, that's a mistake. Sorry about that, gentlemen. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk some about all the excitement in Paris. And you can start right off the bat, Chris, by helping me out and telling me what exactly happened in qualifying. Because boy, did I not even have a chance to even think about seeing that.
Well, the big story of qualifying was Mahindra being thrown out of both the group qualifying and the Super Pole sessions because their tyres were rather heavily under pressure by 0.1 bar. And that is a significant amount. A small amount would usually be 0.2 or 0.3 bar, and there's even a tolerance level. So to be out by 7 times that basically is a huge amount. And of course, that cost Pascal Wehrlein pole position. But then you would also argue, did he get pole position because of his under-pressured tyres? That's exactly why both cars got thrown out of qualifying. And it was costly for D'Ambrosio as well, because we've been talking, how qualifying has not been his strong point. The car itself isn't strong in qualifying trim, and neither is he, really. And so for most of these races, he's been qualifying very, very low down on the field and been making life so hard for himself, having to haul himself back up the order. He actually did quite well, in sixth place. That's a super pole position. But again, was he there because of his under-pressure tyres?
Well, I think that's a really good question. Did you happen to catch any of qualifying, Anil?
I saw the highlights of it. I can't promise. Unfortunately, I can't say I watched the whole thing. Stephen, can I ask you then? Chris Stevens. We got there eventually. Can I ask, did they come up with a reason for why the Mahindras were disqualified? Was it a kind of a process? Was it a failure of some equipment? Was it just a simple error?
Equipment. They looked at their tools and they weren't properly calibrated. And so they were giving them false readings. And I've got to say, that's really the only explanation you can give for it being so out. Okay. If it was a small margin, you could believe if it was just human error. But to be out by so far, you do have to look at the tools and say, yeah, they weren't properly calibrated.
Okay, so ahead of this qualifying session, there was loads of talk kind of on Twitter. Some of the drivers had brought it up and about the qualifying segment as a whole, and if it was unfair because it was throwing up some chaotic results, which, as a viewer, it gives us some really good racing and puts cars out of position. What was your overall feeling about that going into this weekend? Because again, the qualifying session in terms of the results and different teams, different drivers, seems to be quite exciting, but I couldn't help but feel it just looked a bit artificial.
I think in this instance, it was more down to how your lap went, because this is such a tricky circuit to nail a lap on. There was definitely the effect of the varying grip levels, because you just see the amount of rubbish that is on the track, all sorts of tree detritus, that just strewn around the track. And it's mainly a lot of pollen as well. We talked about that in the pre-show as well, the preview show. So there is a difference, but I feel like it didn't dominate this session, because you see Andre Lotterer, he was in Q2, got through to Superpole. Stoffel Van Dorn, for example, in Q4 was only 13th in the provisional results. So it did still very much come down to where your lap put you in terms of its ability. Because you see, once again, we had another big difference between the DS Techicha drivers. For example, Vern, way down the order, and he didn't have a suspension issue this time like he did in the last race in Rome.
Okay, well, I have a quick question for you then before we go on, because as we all know, the racing gods giveth and the racing gods taketh away. And since we're talking about the taketh aways right now, if we're talking about Mahindra, we had been discussing sort of their pace and whether or not we thought they would be able to get back onto it. Aside from the tires being improperly inflated for qualifying, does it seem like maybe they're back on pace after this, or is it still sort of an open question? We couldn't tell, because obviously the race presented certain obstacles to evaluating their pace that qualifying did not.
Yeah, there's no way we can read into pretty much anything from this race. I mean, a bit of qualifying, but for Mahindra is really, really difficult to tell, because we didn't even get practice running in, because FP1 was completely soaked out. And we saw all sorts of craziness just in that session alone, with Degrassi spinning in a straight line, Vern spinning off under braking and miraculously not hitting anything despite doing a 360. Cars simply unable to stop and clattering into one another. It was absolute mayhem, and a bit of a preview for the race to come. But with that, there was just nothing you could read into the session, and we only had a very short, brief FP2 window in which not all the cars took place because they banged up their cars in FP1.
Right. Well, we know from Formula One, then, the shorter the free practices, the more entertainment we as viewers are in for. But Anil, you said you watched the highlights of qualifying. Were all of these things included in those highlights?
Yes. So I just want to go back to the point about the Mahindra and the pace of them, if that's okay, Matt.
Yeah.
I think D'Ambrosio is still. I know we'll talk about the race result, but D'Ambrosio is still, I think, 5th in the Drivers' Championship. He's got 12 points in the. But he's only collected 12 points across the last 4 races. So, that's quite a dramatic turn of events, because the fact that he's still 5th and well within a win of the top is obviously very good. And you can fight for the title, but they seem to start the season really strong. And I just wonder if they've kind of, I don't know if it's set up or just confidence in the car, but they just seem to have stalled.
The thing is, it's not just Ambrosio, though, who has had a lot of low-scoring races lately. It's Vern, it's DaCosta, it's Degrassi before this race as well, because the qualifying format just throws you at the back of the grid most of the time. I saw a stat in the in the Autosport Slack. There was I think the championship leader before this race had scored like a third of the available points, which, to be leading the championship with is pretty astonishing. So we really are seeing an inconsistent battle. That's why we still have 13 guys able to compete for the title realistically still.
Yeah, I've got to say, actually, on that, Roland's pole position lap was absolutely amazing.
Well, let's talk about.
Or are you going to correct me?
No,
Disagree with me.
No, I can't, because I said a week ago on this show, Nissan are going to be so damn quicker. And look what happened. They locked out the front row, and they should have won this race. They should have won this race. And we're going to get into why they didn't.
Good, because I was looking for who the racing gods were going to give it away to, and they gave it away to Nissen, and we were talking about this being a race for them, the way the track sets up, the way they've set up their particular usage of energy, the number of motors they use, all of it looked to be very, very good for them. And once Mahindra was disqualified, pole position for Roland, who has been challenging Buemi all season long. So I tell you what, why don't you go now, Chris, and tell us a little bit more about where the race was won and lost?
What was important for me was how this race started, because they did a rolling start because there was a shower in between qualifying and the race, and part of the grid, the right-hand side of the grid, because it's all covered by trees, was still wet. And they felt it would be unjust and unfair if they were to do a standing start with half the grid starting on a damp patch. And to that, I say pish. That is what you are dealt with. That is the grid. Deal with it, right? It's not unfair. That's just how the dice has been rolled for this race. And they should have just left it.
Well, oh, that's harsh, Chris. Come on. Come on. I mean, didn't the same thing happen in Rome?
Nope.
I seem to recall there was another race where it started slightly damp and the racing line on.
I don't recall that. I mean, the thing is, there's always a difference.
Okay, but it's not like it's like a dirty and a clean line. You know, in most motorsport series, pole position will be on the clean side of the grid, so you get a bit more grip going. But if you're on a wet part of the track, you're going to lose 2-3 meters. So
what?
If you've qualified second, so you've gone faster than the guy that's finished third or fifth. Oh, sorry, third or fifth. You shouldn't be in a worse off position than them.
That's racing. That is racing. That is how.
I'm sorry. That is Chris. I'm judging you right now, Matt. You better back me up on this because Chris is talking rubbish.
I was just going to chime in with the fact that I recall that in Formula One they brought blowers out to clean up puddles on grid spots. Was it not at Suzuka a year or two ago? Did we not see this exact complaint happen and be sorted by the FIA?
I recall it happened to Hamilton, actually. Suzuka 2016. He started second and was down to 7th or so by the first corner because he started on a wet patch of the track.
Yeah, so...
which was ridiculous.
And here's the thing. I will be honest. After having seen the cars on a fully wet track, it seems like if you've got an entire half of the grid that's going to have wet tires, cold brakes, and I would go for full tanks, but obviously batteries doesn't make a difference, screaming into the first turns... Well, if half the cars can brake and half the cars can't brake, you're just asking for a safety issue that you'd really rather not have as a race director, I would think. But that's my take on it. Chris, so do you have any more insight into the decision making beyond just not liking it?
No, it was quite a late call, to be honest. Didn't really get decided until about 5 minutes before lights out. I imagine it was done from a safety point of view. I feel like if this were a more open circuit, they might have let this one go. And we talked in the preview show about how tight and unforgiving this circuit is. And in a way, that's nice. In another way, it takes away from the show. But that's, for me, that's just the way that the cookie crumbled. I think that those guys could have and should have handled it.
Right, okay, so... if there was a dead squirrel, several dead squirrels on the P2 spot, right? That's racing, according to you, yeah? So the driver parks up on P2. Oh, sorry, I can't drive. I can't go. You're like, no.
That's debris. That's different.
Oh, okay, someone throws a snowball.
This is good. We are going to be here forever if we keep on adjudicating this particular issue. Yes, debris. But it is a safety issue, and I think it was reasonable, although annoying, that they had to start behind the safety car. That's what I'm going to say about it. But we're not only here to talk about the wet side of the grid and the start. A lot more happened at the start beyond that. So, Chris, take us into the race a little bit deeper, if you would, please.
Okay, I'm going to round off the start by reading out Stuart Neal's comment from the chat room, which says, Bernie wanted sprinklers, so what are they worried about? On to the rest of the race. Oliver Rowland, my heart sank. I actually screamed at the screen when we saw the shot of him crashing into the barriers from the lead. And God knows, if anyone who's listened to the show knows, I like Ollie Rowland. I love the fact that he has come in, minimal, no testing practically, and in 2 or 3 races has risen and gone beyond the level of what a lot of people on this panel, I believe, will consider the Formula E king, Sebastian Buemi, and has gone on to take podiums and challenge for the victory. And this should have been his race. And my immediate thought was, is this a return of the brake-by-wire issues we saw Sebastian Buemi struggling with a couple of races ago?
And this is what I wanted to know too after looking at it, because it just, I mean, the only 2 explanations are, number one, he was busy, playing Tetris on his steering wheel and entirely missed his braking point. Or number 2, the car did not react as he anticipated it would. And I'm curious, have you heard anything else about that? And then we'll ask Anil what he thinks.
The team has not confirmed. They're still investigating what went wrong with the car. So we'll probably know a little bit more by the time we get to Monaco. And we'll get an explanation then. But for me, it looked so similar to Buemi's incidents in Sanya, his race-ending crash in Santiago as well. It just looked identical. And for me, Ollie Rowland is not the kind of driver who would make a mistake like that while in the lead so early into a race.
Right. And Anil, this is something that has happened to the Nissan drivers before. But what did you make of it when you saw him just literally spearing the wall out of nowhere, not even really under pressure yet?
Right. I mean, first of all, it looked like he actually hit the brakes. Let me rephrase that. It looked as though he didn't miss his braking zone. He said after the race that the car just wouldn't stop. So I also doubt he was pushing flat out because it's such a difficult track to overtake on. To me, it genuinely did seem like a problem with the car. I was gutted for him because the fact that you've got drivers like him and Frines that, leading the way, and the fact that, as Chris mentioned, he's beating Sebastian Buemi, who really since season 1 has kind of been the go-to guy. He is the benchmark in the series. So yeah, I was gutted for him as a fellow Brit.
Just on how much they're pushing at the beginning of a race, actually, I was really interested to find out that actually at the beginning of a race, these days especially, that they push harder earlier in the race than they do later on, for 2 reasons. One, I suppose they're trying to get a gap for attack mode, and also because they're gambling on safety cars, basically, because you can nearly guarantee it in races, especially at this track as well. They're so common, but also so that they can get to the threshold of usable energy remaining where they're allowed to regen. So I think it's above 85% of usable energy remaining, or around that level. You're not allowed to use any regen. So once you hit that marker, you're allowed to regen. And actually, teams want to hit that quicker. It sounds crazy, burning through energy quicker than you need to, but that's actually the better level to be at. That's why they had to introduce a rule saying that you cannot start a race with less than 97% of energy remaining in the battery.
Well, I'm going to ask, I mean, then do we see that as, like, if you just put it to me like that, Anil, I think, oh, well, it's obvious. You use up a whole chunk of energy that you can't replace and get to the point where you can replace it. That gives you more usable energy averaged out over the course of every minute of the race. And that is clever strategy, as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. That has completely gone over my head. When the sport gets so complicated. Can we move on past Rowland's retirement to the great battle between Buemi and Robin Frines? Because that was the highlight of the race for me.
Great battle ruined by attack mode.
Okay, so I know what you're going to say here, which is when I first saw this incident happen, and by incident, I'm talking about the contact between the 2 drivers. Buemi goes in deep, the corner before the attack mode activation. I don't know if that was because he was defending. But anyway, he then cuts back to get onto the attack mode, which is what causes the contact between the 2 drivers.
Yeah, exactly. Because the attack mode was placed in a stupid location like I said at the beginning of the show, they put it in the wrong place. It was originally further down that straight. So what I said in the preview show about how they're not going to lose much time is because it was further down the straight, and they moved it back just before shakedown, I think it was, so that you had to go super, super tight into the hairpin to make it. So the reason Buemi was going wide and then coming back, like we saw with drivers taking it slower in where the attack zone was in Mexico and in Saudi and in Rome as well. And in two of those races, we saw guys going into the back of one another because they're going into the corner slower. And look what's happened now. Somebody went into the back of someone and it took out the race leader. Unacceptable.
Right. And the reason why they're putting it in those positions is to make it, is to cost the driver time initially when they're getting it.
But then what was wrong with where they placed it in Sanya, in Marrakesh, on the outside of a corner where it actually worked brilliantly?
Yeah, I have a feeling they could have just moved it, even if it was 10 meters further down, because it was a...
No, it should have been on the outside of a corner.
I love it that you sound like a parent scolding a child when you talk about the location of the attack zone, Stevens. This is absolute brilliance. They put it there. I'm sure they moved it back because they wanted it to cost a little more time.
Yeah.
It didn't seem like it really cost very much time at all, even where they moved it. Now, am I understanding also then that this collision happened because of the location, but that would have been responsible for what happened to Buemi that made the battle go bye-bye?
Gave him a puncture.
Yeah.
And once again, we're coming back to the thing of the cars too hard at the front, too exposed at the rear.
Right. So there was also some damage to Franz's car as well, and there were quite a few radio messages between him and his engineer where he was just discussing that there was something wrong and he just kind of wanted some assurance that nothing was dangling off. But it seemed pretty minor.
Yeah, look, we've seen these cars take harder, bigger hits and just carry on. The fact that his front wing, which, let's be honest, it doesn't create downforce. If that were even an F3 car, that would be an issue. But these cars do not create downforce with their wings.
Right, and I guess the best example of that, sorry, Chris, but yeah, the best example of that is the fact that Roland, after he had his accident and was at the back, set fastest lap.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow,
exactly.
But it was wet by then. I think what Franz was really concerned with was the fact that it was making so much noise over the pavement before the rains came as he was going faster, because it was essentially teetering back and forth on its one stanchion that was still attached. It was scraping the pavement repeatedly, and he was concerned that that noise was his car, literally falling apart, I think.
Yeah, and obviously with them electric, you can hear it a lot louder, of course, as well, because they don't make engine noise. Going from the chat room said, Chris, are you saying it's your fault that they moved it after listening to your race preview and realized it was too easy? I like to think we have that level of influence over the FIA and the sport in general on this show.
Yes, I like to say I hear from the paddock that we were listened to by all the important people, and I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. And he was just laughing off camera. He's like, "Oh, we've had it." But it was tragic, Anil, to see Buemi go out with that puncture, because it was shaping up to be an epic battle, and it was fantastic to see not only Buemi at the front, but Nissan. I mean, even with Roland having done himself in, they still were in with what looked like to be a real shot, and then it all just kind of went sideways.
Yeah, it was an absolutely disastrous weekend for them. Normally, when Buemi's leading, you kind of just expect him to it's a guaranteed result. And even though he's made mistakes in the past, that they tended to be over one lap. So when he was leading and I saw Franz catching him, and then I started to notice, I think it was the likes of Lotterer and that group catching them. I think it was quite obvious, even after a couple of laps, that Buemi just had a small issue. And then once his tyre went, it went. But yeah, as you say, disastrous, because they should have at least had one driver on the top step of the boat. Well, they should have had at least one driver on the podium, and it probably would have been the top step.
So I will now say Monaco is where Nissan will become the 8th different team to win a race, and we'll get our 9th different winner. Because again, it's going to suit them. but
right.
I'm looking too far ahead.
How much
Okay.
money are you putting on that?
£1 million.
Right. Okay. So when are you going to put your deposit down there, Chris?
How about we'll call it like 10p a day until it adds up.
Okay.
Spoken like somebody who really doesn't have that money in his back pocket. I will have to say it.
Yeah, you didn't sound very confident there. I just want to bring up the circuit actually. When Buemi started losing time to Friends, I just began to wonder if the circuit was almost a bit too difficult to even get an overtake done in the dry. And I was actually beginning to worry if the entire race was going to be like that. Thankfully, it wasn't, because we had a few chunks of hail, and by a few, I mean a lot. But it did just seem as though even with a damaged car, Buemi was going to hang in there for a while.
Yeah, we talked about this last week, didn't we? About how the circuit, even before Gen 2, wasn't really a great track for racing and for overtaking. And I think with the Gen 2 cars, it was even worse. Case in point about how this circuit doesn't let the Gen 2 car breathe. In Rome, they were 6 seconds quicker than they were the year before. In Paris, they were struggling to match the same lap time that they did the year before. And that is just because they cannot use the extra power that they have these days. And with the downforce levels pretty similar, or even a little bit less than last season, the Gen 2 car just doesn't perform there. And for me, it's an outdated track now. And potentially why it's a good reason why this could be one of the last Paris E-Prix.
I think we actually had a very similar conversation a couple of years ago when we reviewed the season 3 race. But I do think this circuit is as tight as a street race can probably be. Although, I mean, I say that and we're going to Monaco, which is going to be even harder to overtake. But as beautiful as the circuit is, it really showed in that Buemi Friends battle that, if a damaged car can hold on to the lead that easily, the circuit's probably at fault.
Yeah, at least Monaco has, a proper surface and is a proper racing venue. Unlike the streets of Paris, just to clarify on what I said a minute ago, there is a chance that depending on how the next mayoral election goes in Paris, this might be the end of the Paris E-Prix. And I, for one, will not lose much sleep over it if they get rid of it.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that, but I mean, you could even look at something like the Lauder or Massa overtake as being an example of the track just not providing enough room for the cars to race the way they've been designed to.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think the circuit's right on the limit. I've got to ask, actually, in that case, Chris, about the circuit and the weather that we ended up getting. Because I did mention that the rain started falling fairly early on. There was a really great camera shot. I think it was kind of looking past Turn 9, the Eiffel Tower in the background, and you could see the dark clouds coming. Before the race, were they expecting more rain? Because when I tuned in, it was kind of, they were already on the grid.
Yeah, rain was forecast for it. It actually came quite a bit later than they expected because, like I said, they had that shower in between qualifying and the race, and I think they actually expected that to kind of hold up. So I don't think they were expecting a dry start, and that's why we ended up with this scenario of the two sides of the grid, one being dry, one being wet. And but I think the hail caught them out, though. I've never seen a race taking place in actual hail, and it really did just cause absolute mayhem. And like I said, we saw in the practice session cars off all over the place because they've got no downforce. They've got instant torque of the electric motor. So they're spinning their wheels even halfway down a straight when they're actually gathering a bit of speed and momentum. But there's nothing pressing the car down. And at best, those tires don't have an awful lot of grip on them anyway, because they're skinny and they're street tires for a start. And where they've got the fresh tarmac down over the cobbled section, that temporary tarmac that they lay down and then scoop up after the race and recycle, loads of grip in the dry, but put a bit of water on it and it becomes slick as anything. It's the worst part of the circuit. So that'll be why we saw a lot of it extreme into it. And it makes these professional racing drivers look very amateurish.
Well, I had wanted actually to ask about that, specifically the tires. And Michelin says they are all-weather tires. Now, granted, the amount of water that we saw coming down during the full course yellow, the first one, was not raceable because there was just too much water pooled on the surface. But once we went back to racing, is this just what you get when you let people race on surfaces in conditions like that? Or is this the other end of we have one tire for all weather for the whole season?
No, the tire itself will be fine for what its purpose is, which is, to be a road tire. For transferring 250 kilowatts of power, which let's not forget is the thick end of 370 brake horsepower, through a very skinny tire onto a surface that already doesn't have a lot of grip in extreme amounts of water in a car that has no aerodynamic downforce. It's just a combination of all of those things.
And of course, the drivers that had attack mode activated had that extra little bit of horsepower. So every time they were putting their foot down on the throttle, the back ends were squirming just a little bit. And there were some really good shots of, I think it was Frines actually, which I don't want to jump to the end of the race. There were some shots in the closing laps of Frines leading with attack mode, and he was constantly going sideways. And it was great to watch.
And the other thing they have to contend with as well is the painted white lines, which are also really, really slippery. If you have a tire on that painted white line and you start to brake, you will not stop for the corner. That's it. You're going into the escape road. And we saw Sebastian Buemi fall afoul of that in the practice session as well. And that's what makes, very well-trained athletes look like your average Joe behind the wheel doing donuts in his Dodge Viper in a Tesco car park. Now, the other thing to compound that as well is you're on a super tight street course. Okay. And Andre Lauter actually said, I'm not sure I felt like taking the risk to go for the win. And for me, that's kind of what locked down the positions at the front of the field. France had a small advantage. Lotterer would have been very happy to take a second consecutive podium finish because that's not something he's done before, I think, actually, if memory serves me correctly. So for me, that's what ultimately got France the win and Lotterer just a podium and secured the podium for Daniel Abt as well.
And right. I'm glad you brought him up because, yeah, absolutely. He looked like somebody who was really going to be taking some risks this time around, and it paid off for him.
Are we talking about Daniel Abt here?
Yes.
Oh, I love watching him. Just before the rain came down, he had a really good battle with Felipe Massa, and Massa had to defend really aggressively, almost pushing him up against the wall. And I love that idea of the older guy, the experienced guy who's been in Formula One, he's won races against the younger Daniel Abt, who he's a pretty good overtaker. As soon as the rain fell, though, I must admit, when there was a shot of Felipe Massa shortly after that battle with Daniel Abt of his visor, and it was slightly open. And the commentators mentioned, Chris, that they didn't have, the drivers don't have they don't have a certain visor that you would normally use in wet conditions. And I cannot be the only person that thought of Malaysia 2009 when Felipe was on the radio saying, I can't see anything, I need my visor. And Rob Medley kind of comes on and goes, Felipe, baby, stay cool. That was it was the exact same situation. I found it absolutely hilarious. But Chris, it'd be good to hear about the visor situation. And if, do drivers have two sets of visors with them? What's the deal? Why did Felipe have his helmet up? Because, I don't know, I'm a simple guy, but if it's hailing, I would kind of protect my face.
So I don't think there are different types of visor. You have different shades of visor. So obviously in the rain conditions where there's a lot of cloud and less light, you want a clearer visor so the visibility is not obstructed by a tinted visor in comparison. The issue he had, I was going to get into this in the F1 alumni, but we may as well tackle it now, was that it was like leaking for some reason. And he was getting a load of water in his helmet and he was having to open it to try and clear some of it out. And he said he's never had this issue before in his entire career. It was a very new one, and it contributed to the spin he had shortly after he was passed by Daniel Abs, who has arrived this season. I remember last year, he had a stunning comeback through the field from a lowly grid position, and he was storming through on a track where it's really, really difficult to overtake. He was the one making up places, and it was the same this year from seventh on the grid, storming, but out-qualified Degrassi as well, storming through to a podium place. I thought he was sensational in this race. Driver of the day for me.
All right, then let's talk about Audi for a brief bit before we get to the end of the race. They had a very stealthy, but very, very successful race. They seem to look exceptionally good on the low grip, less power sensitive circuit. Is that a clue to sort of where they have been all season long and to where we might look for them to excel in the coming races?
I think they benefited from some issues, Lucas in particular. Daniel was storming through. He was unstoppable. I probably would have challenged higher up had the race sort of continued on a normal way, if it hadn't rained, for example.
That's a polite way of saying if Mortaro hadn't lost his mind.
Yeah, maybe. The thing without it, once again, though, they were outpaced by Envision Virgin Racing, and I have absolute confidence that they would have had both cars right up there had Sam Bird not crashed in FP1 late into the session, which meant his car wasn't ready for FP2. So he went into qualifying with no dry laps, no qualifying lap under his belt as well. And then, of course, got involved in some incidents in the race as well. For Franks, it worked out a lot better. Despite him also throwing it at the wall, his car was, because he did it earlier, his car was ready for FP2. So he got away with it. So the powertrain was working well there, obviously. But once again, we're seeing the customer outpace the manufacturer.
We have, Anil, and that's something that we rarely see in Formula One. So is this exciting to you to see Envision Virgin outdoing their powertrain, their manufacturer, their big brother team?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that was happening in Formula One, I think the sport would be in really good shape. But it simply won't happen because the technology there is just a bit more complicated and the resource disparity. Certainly, in terms of just looking at the results for qualifying for races, the fact that we've had, 8 different winners in the first 8 races, which is an unbelievable streak. It clearly works. The regulations are clearly delivering. That said, I feel as though it's very hard to really take this result and say, oh, the cars are performing roughly in this order, or it's been a big step for a certain team, because there were so many incidences. There were so many cars crashing out. Sometimes there were cars going straight up into walls. We had a second full course yellow when I think Bird, Sims, and Roland all went out. So it just seemed like it was one of those races where you can't really look at the result and get an idea for the raw pace of the cars and who's feeling more comfortable. In many cases, I think for most of the mid-pack, it was just getting to the end.
It was, but I'll tell you what, you could look at that race and take away that Robin Friens is a driver that is exceptionally, exceptionally talented, because those were not easy conditions. His car was wounded, and he never looked close to dropping it.
Ever since he crossed the line sideways with rear broken suspension in Putrajaya, in a car that was a year old as well, because Andretti hadn't designed their own powertrain for that season, I thought this kid is pretty mega. Some people might have looked at his GP3 results and thought he was mega from then as well, but I didn't really watch GP3 in those days, and so I was maybe a bit late to the Franks train party, but man, oh man, that kid is just I can't even call him a kid anymore, because he's he's an Audi factory driver now. He's matured into a great racing driver, and for me, this is a long overdue maiden win in the series.
I seem to recall being at Formula E actually when he started his career, and everyone spoke so highly of him as if he was like the next big thing, and just how lucky the series was to have him.
And like his teammate at the time, Antonio Felix da Costa, a kind of fallout of the Red Bull Junior program. One of the guys that I look at and think, why did you let him go?
Especially now,
Yeah,
looking at Red Bull. But as a Formula E fan, I have to say thank you very much, because we've picked up more than a few talented drivers that maybe Formula One should have given a better look to.
Oh, believe me, they will have contacted them during the whole Toro Rosso debacle over the course of last season.
Can we talk about some of the ridiculous incidences the crashes we saw during this race? Because some of them were clumsy, some of them were unfortunate. There was one in particular, though, which I think was quite possibly the worst attempted overtake I've ever seen. And I have a feeling you guys know what I'm talking about, but it's Mortara and Lynn. He was miles behind, and it's not even a braking zone. Like, it's barely a braking zone.
It's a little dab, maybe just a lift off in qualifying, but it is a bit of a dab and a flick, isn't it?
Was that an issue? And I'm just going to ask real quick. Was that an issue where he had already lost control of the car before he hit that braking zone? Because it was hard to tell if he was even in control of the car and trying to you're talking about when he put them both on the wall, brought the safety car, right? Like, you could see the wheels off the ground too, which is like awesome, but not really, because it would have been more fun to see green flag at the end. Was he already out of control? Have we heard anything else about that incident since then?
Certainly wasn't in control when he got to the apex of the corner. No, I think it was a bit of overambition from Edo. I think the red mist may have descended a little bit because he'd already kind of thrown it down the escape road as well. It was within the space of 15 seconds, Venturi went from being in a really strong double points paying position to one car spinning and one car down the escape road and crashing into other guys. And it turned sour really, really quickly. That actually does bring us quite nicely onto the F1 alumni, with Felipe Massa, who eventually got, P9. It could have been more, But the thing that I'm looking at with Venturi, we've talked a lot about their drive shaft issues this season, and it was confirmed in Paris by Dario Franchitti, actually, that they did upgrade the drive shaft. And the next sentence I'm about to say is going to make it sound like a downgrade, but it's an upgrade in terms of reliability. So this would have happened quite a few weeks ago, actually, because I think it's 31 days to get a homologated part change approval by the FIA. So we saw this with Audi and their inverters last season. They changed it on Lucas di Grassi's car because it kept failing the same part in the first few races. So it's a similar scenario here. What they've done, they've changed the drive shaft from carbon fiber to steel, which is, it might work better for reliability, but it's a lot heavier and it's a lot less efficient.
Well, see, now here I'm going to bring out some of my specialized bike knowledge. There's steel, and there's steel. It's all going to depend on the particular alloy that they run, and it's also going to depend on how they build it. In the high-end bike world, everyone uses carbon fiber or titanium now. But back when I was racing, you could get a steel frame set that was within, half a kilo or so of a carbon fiber frame set if you were willing to pay the money for the fancy blend of steel. And Columbus, who else? I think, was it Fuji? There were a couple of manufacturers who made high-end, Ishiwata made high-end. Reynolds also would make steel, would make high-end steel alloys for that. And so I would be very curious to see where they've gone and specifically what kind of a weight penalty they've incurred for themselves. And I'm sure they're not going to tell us, but you're raising your hand like you might have information, Chris Stevens. Tell us the answer, please. Oh, I'm dying now.
No, they won't say how much it weighs. But I mean, even if it is half a kilo, that is an extra half a kilo that they have to lug around. And that is just going to be costing them efficiency in the race. And that's the name of the game in Formula E. So there's no doubt that they might finish some more races now, but they're not going to be as quick, it would seem.
Well, it's just down to the trade-off. How much weight? Are they giving up ballast? Are they overweight? I mean, that's what it is, versus being able to finish races when you're in points paying position, assuming your drivers don't both lose their minds simultaneously, right? Anil?
Force equals mass times acceleration. That is as much as I can contribute to that discussion.
And to add another layer onto that as well, let's say, even for example, I doubt this is the case for most teams, but even if they were underweight and they were using ballast to get up to the minimum weight, that ballast is strategically placed so that they can get a nice weight distribution, a nice low center of gravity. If they then have to give up that ballast for the sake of the powertrain, it's not where they want it, because that weight is going out in the rear. And as we all remember from heavy twin motor systems from the early days of open powertrain development, it's not where you want the weight.
No, it isn't. But it may not be as much of a weight penalty as the material itself implies. That was, I guess, where I was going. Shall we go officially now, Chris, and talk a little bit about our other F1 alumnus? So you've mentioned Massa and his spin. Where did he wind up ultimately?
P9, I reckon a top 5 was possible for him, especially because he was battling away with Maxi Gunter, an even younger gun than when he was battling with Daniel Apton. They have some previous from Santiago, of course. So that was a really good battle to watch. Unfortunately, Stoffel Van Dorn out again after being hit. I think he was caught up in the whole Roland Sims, D'Ambrosio, Bird mayhem all down at turn 3 when they all went off. So that was unfortunate for him, because points probably were on offer if it was just a race for survival, as proved by Pascal Wehrlein, P10 from last on the grid. But what could have been?
Isn't it great that the former Formula One drivers aren't coming in and just succeeding really easily? Because it's showing the challenge of Formula E. The fact that you've got these drivers who perhaps didn't get a fair enough shot in other series coming in and doing really well, people like Friends, etc. I think it would, if Wehrlein, if Massa, if Van Dorn all came in and were qualifying first, second and third, finding it really easy, I think it would kind of diminish it would diminish that kind of integrity that Formula E has.
What are you talking about? They're all just washed up and they're all useless. There's a reason they got booted out of F1 and they all goes to age.
Lack o' cash.
But can I just clarify? Because somebody will take me seriously. That was sarcasm. Please don't believe me.
Yes, Chris was officially being sarcastic. Okay. Any other business? Anything else we have failed? I mean, I feel like we've left all of the race out because there were so many, as Anil referenced earlier, so many insane incidents in the closing laps of the race once they tried to go green again.
Yes. So I'm going to run through any other business. Lucas Di Grassi, P4, good points for his championship. As we know, he has not had some high scoring races of late. And with so many guys, once again, not scoring big in this race, this could be quite a crucial result come the New York finale. Maxi Gunter. I want to talk about Maxi Gunter because, again, he's just proving he should be in that car in a race where the most experienced drivers even managed to get it horrifically wrong. Here was the young gun with way less experience being the mature head and not throwing it in the barriers and not making ridiculous overtaking maneuvers and scoring an amazing P5 finish and qualified well as well. It's not like he came up from the back from attrition. He qualified in P7. That, to me, is evidence that he should be the man in that car. No disrespect to Felipe Nasr, but it seems like because he was due to be in this race, but he prioritized his preparations for his next IMSA race, right? And if this is just going to be a thing that happens all the time now, I have to now even just prepare for this IMSA race. Like before it clashed, fair enough. But now when you're actually having to prioritize your preparations for this over a race, that to me says he's not your guy right now. And Max is doing a stellar job. He should be in the car for the rest of the season, in my opinion. I'm going to go across the rest of the title contenders as well. Jeff, P6, nice recovery from P12 qualifying, not so great there. DaCosta, P7, so not great points, but points nonetheless. And the big hitters who did not score points, Jerome D'Ambrosio, having made up so many places from the back of the grid, once again hauling himself up there, this time not of his own making from poor qualifying pace, but then throwing it away in the last few laps and earning himself a 3-place grid penalty for Monaco with that ridiculous move towards the end of the race as well. And Sam Bird, so I mentioned he didn't get a practice qualifying lap in, so was down in qualifying because of that as well. And he was hit by Jerome D'Ambrosio. So he only ended up P11, just outside the points. That's going to sting. That's going to sting.
Indeed it does. How about you, Anil? Anything else you want to mention before we move on to our awards?
Can we talk about how much of the race was missed because of full course yellows or safety cars? It seemed to be a lot of people saying, "Oh, it was one of the best Formula E races. There was so much chaos." But actually, I felt as though because it was a timed race and because they got rid of the laps, I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of that race wasn't racing.
And here we go again with the timed format argument. It worked great in Mexico City, but so far that's been 1+ for an awful lot of negatives so far across the season.
Yeah, I would agree, especially if we compare it to Rome. I think Rome was an infinitely better race than this. This had excitement to it. There was all sorts of craziness and crashing, which is, always mildly fun. But in terms of a race to just sit you on the edge of your seat to see who's actually going to be able to win it, no, I didn't really get that.
No, it wasn't a good motor race, was it? Very dramatic, but not good racing.
So do we think then, Anil, I mean, do you like the timed format? Do you think they should go back to laps, or do you think they should just make it longer?
I don't really know what the solution is here. I also don't understand what was wrong with the lap system. Chris, can you explain the rationale behind the switch? Because I'm not overly familiar with it.
Well, the idea is to get Mexico-like scenarios, where, the leader's done a lap more than we thought. We don't have enough energy for it. But for me, in a way, that also creates false discipline because then you're just taking people out of the race. And for me, you should be trying to get more cars into the action rather than taking them out like that. For me, I also think they underestimated, how far the Gen 2 car can go because we've seen a lot of flat out races. So I think there's a few solutions. Make the races longer. Safety car, full course yellow comes out. Stop the clock. Or go back to the old lap distance.
Stopping the clock could actually work, although, again, it depends down to capacity and how long is actually spent under the safety car periods. But it did feel like once the rain came down, I don't think we really got more than 2 or 3 laps at once without, the battles didn't really get to settle because there was always a safety car or someone hitting a wall. I've got to also say, from a viewing experience, if you're talking about the race, let's use Formula 1, for example. On lap 8, this happened. On lap 10, this happened. Because I've got no idea what the lap count is, my recollection of the race is after 16 minutes, this happened. But then 18 minutes in, I'm not a fan of it. And in a perfect world, I wish they changed it back to how it used to be.
Finally, go back to laps just so I can tell everybody what lap a thing happened on. It's just, even if they're doing it by times, just put a little lap counter down in the corner so we know, so we can reference it later when we want to talk about it. Because, of course, everybody wants to talk about Formula E. It is the best thing racing-wise, except for maybe MotoGP, but there's not enough wheels there. So we all agree on that. Right, Chris?
You only need one wheel to go forward.
This is true.
That's the caveman. Also, just missing out on the points was Ollie Turvey, and he would have been, but he hit Felipe Massa in the closing stages of that race and sent them both into the escape road. And he actually got a converted drive-through penalty for that. So that knocked him out of a points-paying position. And with Tom Dillman out because he crashed as well, then that is a huge open goal that Nissan has missed, unfortunately. And so they remain the lowest point scorers of the season so far. Mitch Evans, his point streak has come to an end as well after an early crash. And this was all to the benefit of Gary Paffett, who added more points to the HWA Race Lab points tally. So really good for him in P8, that was actually. Jose Maria Lopez, we talked about his aggression in Rome, seems to be lingering a little bit because he threw it into the wall in qualifying and didn't score points after he was hit by Jerome D'Ambrosio when he went out of the race as well. And Alexander Sims was hit by Oliver Rowland as well. So Rowland, D'Ambrosio, and Mortara all have 3-place grid penalties for Monaco. And that's going to sting for Rowland the most, I think, because as I said earlier, Nissan have got another great opportunity for a win in Monaco. And it being Monaco, a grid drop is going to hurt more than most places.
Yeah, it will, and it really did seem to bring out the crazy in everybody, that kind of weather. I'm surprised you didn't mention the Neos trying to take each other out when they were actually in a halfway decent running order. I mean, it seemed to be across the board. Everybody lost their mind at this race.
Yeah, I mean, it can look like it when, you're really, really struggling to slow down the car because you just have no grip. And so sometimes your intentions can be misread. And you can look a lot crazier than you actually are. But I really enjoyed the racing between the Neos. It was actually a really good battle. And of course, with them not being so much at the front of the field, we don't see them on screens as much. So it was nice for them, I think, to get a bit of airtime, frankly. And because I think those two guys are two quality racing drivers who should be at the front of the field. And it was just great racing between them.
Fair enough. Well, what do you say we move on to the awards? Anil, since you're a guest, tell us, what was your thing of the weekend for this race?
My thing of the weekend was just finally seeing Formula E cars race in the wet. I thought it was a really great sight to see cars that just don't have all that tons of aerodynamics driving them, sticking them to the ground, and watching the drivers really having to fight the cars for the few laps that actually happened.
All right, and what about you, Chris? Did you have a thing of the weekend?
Maxi Gunter, easy.
I would agree. I had no idea that a Dragon car could do that well. And
this season, anyway.
This season, yeah, true, fair enough. This season. All right, Anil, let's go back to you then. Who missed the apex for you, or what? Because it can be a what as well.
I'm going to say Mortara for his attempted overtake on Lynn. If that happened, I tell you what, if Pastor Maldonado did that, the internet would go down because it would be seen as this, incredibly dangerous move that was never on. It was just a bad move. So definitely that's what missed the apex for me.
Very hard to argue with that, right, Chris Stevens? How about you? Has he taken your favorite thing? Did you have a backup?
No, I have
You probably have a long list of things.
I have a really big list. For me, it's got to be attack mode. The placement of it contributed to the leader being taken out of the race. And for me, that is just plain wrong. They need to revisit it.
That is a difficult thing to argue with. So, gentlemen, we have reached the time to plug all of the things. Anil, where can we find you? What are you up to?
You can find me on Twitter at AnilP228. I talk about all things from motorsport to why the most recent episode of Game of Thrones wasn't as good as people think.
Heretic. What about you, Chris? Where can we find you? What are you up to?
My spoiler-free Twitter is at Chris on Racing. You can catch up with all of my racing habits, journalism and PR and podcasting and commentating and all the other things I've been doing lately, including you and me, Matt. We did a quiz podcast on Missed Apex with Sean Kelly as the Quizmeister last night. I won't give away the result because, as I say, I'm hashtag spoiler free, but it was a really enjoyable night, actually. And also, before I forget, I know you want to get in there, but we have the Missed Apex karting video from Rye House coming out probably by the time this comes out. So go on over to the Missed Apex YouTube channel and check that out.
Yes, as we like to say, be on the lookout for it because it's coming out soon. And the quiz battle was epic and close. Closer than people might have thought. That's all I'm going to say. And lots of room to test your own Formula One knowledge, Anil, which is formidable. You perhaps should have been on this quiz.
I am gutted that I'm not on it. I wasn't on that episode, actually. So I'm going to have to make sure I am next time because I have a feeling that I think I've got the knowledge of Matt's experience and the keenness of Chris's. So, yeah, perhaps next time.
I think you would be more the contestant that Sean was looking for than me, I will be honest, without giving anything away. As for me, I am at MattPT55 on the Twitters. You can catch me around and about. Tell me how I'm wrong about everything if you like. I don't mind at all. And come join us on Twitter at eRadio Show as well. And if you're part of our Missed Apex Slack group, which you absolutely should be if you can afford it out of your monthly budget, be sure to join the Formula E channel as well because we talk about all sorts of fun stuff there all the time. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.